These are the times that try men's souls, is what Thomas Paine wrote about a revolutionary period. And Rabbi Sachs's public sermon that I posted to our Facebook site Friday afternoon about how to defeat a politics of fear begins with those words. Though he gave it back in 2017, this sagely rabbi, who's now fighting for his life in a contest with cancer, his words are often prescient, and we just prayed for him in our Misha Berach. How fitting are those words for our moment, this election of 2020. I don't know about you, but I wasn't able to take my own advice and not spend excessive time watching for election news this week. I think I was checking my phone every so often to watch that little tally. What percentage of the votes have come in? Come on, when will we actually know something? I found myself sort of distracted throughout the week, and as I was talking to people and hearing where they're at, something I noticed is that many people are experiencing a sense of suffering, a sense of sort of personalized pain about it all. One of the questions I have is, where is this suffering coming from? It's not exactly like someone snatched our dinner out from underneath of our nose. That might cause suffering. Or if someone defamed us and hurt our reputation, that might also cause suffering. What exactly did we lose this year? I think what we lost is our sense that the world is predictable. We lost our sense that the polls will clearly tell us what the future holds. After 2 mess-ups and 2 elections, that doesn't seem very likely. We can rely on them. We've lost our sense that the past will predict the future, that we know how a particular area of the country, quote, always votes. We've lost our sense of stasis, that things are easily recognizable. But why did we ever expect that the world will be as it has been? Our expectations have been disappointed. Things are not as they had appeared, or perhaps they're simply not as we had hoped. I think this is at the center of many people's sense of personal suffering. Our Parsha offers some invaluable wisdom as we go through a trying time just like this. Let's hear the story of Parshat Vayera. Abraham sees 3 strangers passing by as he sits in the entrance of his tent, and he runs out to them, and he draws them over to his tent for a meal. He exemplifies the kind of confidence that's needed when sharing your own home with strangers. You see, the first part of the Parsha sets Abraham up as a contrast, the most profound contrast to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which will be destroyed in the subsequent story. Here's Abraham running out to welcome the stranger. He's slaughtering animals from his own herd, right? Perhaps before the ideal time, a young heifer at that, right? There's some financial loss in it. He's rushing about to make sure that it can be as convenient as possible for these passers-by. By contrast, when the angels descend to Sodom and Gomorrah, they'll barely have a place to stay. They're almost about to sleep in the square. And then when they are given a place to sleep, then they're attacked by the people of the city. As in, Abraham is ready, more than willing. He's sort of forcing them into receiving his hospitality, as does Lot, his nephew, the righteous Lot, and therefore is spared, but the city does not. The city lacks this basic capacity to bring in the stranger, the outsider. Why is Abraham able to do that? I think Abraham's able to do it, again, because of the covenant that we discussed last week. Abraham knows exactly who he is. He might be living in a tent, a space that only has a couple of flaps between you and all of the outside world, and yet he is more secure than those who live in stone buildings down below in those rich cities on the plain. Abraham doesn't fear. He doesn't abuse or tease or selfishly extort like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it is that he hosts God for dinner in his tent and sends the angelic investigators on their way. And that's also why the hospitable Abraham receives a blessing. The inhospitable cities demonstrate that they, not being capable of welcoming the stranger, are deserving of destruction. The very first word of our Parsha highlights one of the key three themes I want us to contemplate in this story. Vayera, and he appeared. In this case, it's God appearing to Abraham, but notice how he appeared. God shows up outside Abraham's tent in the shape of men walking by, strangers, not people that Abraham already knew. Things are not as they seem in Parshat Vayera right from the beginning. Strangers turn out to be God. Abraham, who sits alone above the plains of Sodom and Gomorrah, seems apparently insecure, and yet he'll be blessed by God, whereas the cities lying ostensibly secure down in the valley and rich are going to be destroyed. There's a profound flip of what things look like. The root, yar, Yud, Resh, Aleph, is a leitmotif of this chapter. It appears again and again. If we continue reading, so after Vayera elav Adonai, Belonei Mamre, we read Vayar, Vehine Shlosha Anashim, and he saw there were three people out there, Nitzavim alav, Vayar, Vayarotz likratam, and he saw and he ran out to them. Abraham seeing, apparently seeing, right, is being highlighted. And then it says, Vayisa enav, right? And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw this, and he ran, and he did that. And they continue to play with the root. Later on, when Sarah famously laughs at the good news that they'll have a son, Isaac, we have the same root, but with a totally different meaning. Ki yareya, it says. It's still the Yud, Resh, Aleph root, but here it means to fear, right? Yareh, to be in fear. I laughed because I was afraid. And that root raises a different meaning of the same thing, right? Appearances, when they're not the way that we expect them to be, can lead to fear. Sarah's afraid about the good news, actually, which is kind of extraordinary, right? Because it's not what she expected. The whole thing profoundly tries to show us that our expectations may be turned on their head in an instant. Secondly, the Parsha wants to highlight what you have to do to learn how things actually are. So when God notices that Sodom and Gomorrah, that things are not going so well down there, he says, Ve'erda, ve'eda'a, ha'katza'akatem, haba'a lefanai. I will go down, and that way I will see whether or not the cry that's come before me is so. And then I'll know about destroying them or not, right? I'll go down and see. God's going to go down? I'll go down there and check out those cities. Does God really need to go and get so close to the cities to know what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah? That doesn't fit with our typical way of thinking about God, right? God knows. Why does he foot it down to the cities and go walking by Abraham's tent on his way to these cities, right? Well, the sages picked up on this and they said, actually, God did it in order to teach us the right way to handle appearances. Don't go merely on appearances. There's a principle of Jewish law that flows from this. If you come to deciding a legal case, you're going to give a ruling, you may not just hear about the situation and give a judgment. You have to go to the location where the thing happened. You can't just sit at home and hear about something, right? You can't just read a headline and suddenly cast judgment on what the other side is doing. You have to go to the place, check out the circumstances. Why? Because inevitably we fill in the gaps in the stories that we hear with our assumptions. And assumptions aren't good enough when making a judgment, and certainly not a legal ruling. So God shows us the example of what you must do to actually learn how things are. In the Jewish tradition, you have to go see the specific case, understand all of its circumstances. If the evidentiary standards of the Torah and Jewish codes were understood, I think they could become an essential element in establishing our society as a more just place to live in. If only we followed such evidentiary standards, we may have much less turmoil, rather than people quickly judging each other based on a quick glance at a headline. Thirdly, our Parsha highlights the hidden righteous one. As God goes down to overthrow these cities and to investigate personally prior, he passes by a single man's tent. And an incredible scenario ensues where he has to actually listen to the standards of apparent justice that Abraham presents to him. Would the judge of all the earth really destroy an entire city because of some of its wicked? What if there were righteous in it? What if, God, there were just 50 righteous people in this city? Would you really overthrow the whole thing? Let's work on the margins here, right? The very small number of people who would stand against evil in society. So he poses first 50, right? And then he breaks it down. He reduces it by a tenth twice. What if there were 45? What if there were 40? Right? Again, kind of working in the sort of fractional logic. What if the smallest number of people actually stood against that path of inhospitality? And then he just breaks it down straight out by 10, right? Now he's reducing it by 30%. What if there were 30, 20? And, oh, if I may be so bold, my Lord, I am but dust and ashes. What if there were just 10? Would you still destroy it? Would you destroy 10 righteous ones? And God, acceding to the logic of Abraham, says, no, I wouldn't. I would spare an entire city of wickedness for but 10 righteous people. I think that this is actually probably the locus of our concept of minyan. Now, the Gemara doesn't cite this passage. Instead, it kind of confusingly cites the 10 wicked spies who gave witness to not go into the land, right? But that's sort of confusing. I think this is the first time that we have mention of this specific number of 10 in the Torah. And sometimes you don't even have to mention things that are as important as that. Whenever you get a first mention of something in the Torah, it's important in our logic. And I'm not the only one to say this. There are other scholars who have pointed out that 10 probably is located here. Now notice that those 10 are described as the righteous ones. If there were just 10 righteous ones, would you preserve the whole city? This passage, I think, is also the basis for our concept of minyan being the thing upon which the whole world stands. In later traditions, people said, well, where would you find such 10 righteous people? Well, likely you'd find them kind of buried in the depths of a shul davening, morning, noon, and night, right? At each of the daily prayer services, they would still be praying. Now, you might say, well, how does the world depend on something so small as minyan, right? It's not important. It doesn't change policy. It doesn't suddenly mean that we're taking care of our poor or doing taxation accurately or having justice in the courts. What does that have to do with anything? The Hasidim really insisted that most of the righteous in the world are hidden. They're what we call tzadikim nistarim. They're hidden away. They're not sort of out in the open. They don't show up on your screen or on television. They're not sort of a big public presence. They're the little people. The people who show up day after day to hold down the institutions upon which we all rely, like a synagogue, like good governance, like a service that we all need. One of the useful things that the pandemic's done, I believe, is to help us understand a bit more our dependencies, whom we depend on, what services we couldn't do without. Today's Parsha seems to be saying that minyan is just such a thing. If only there were 10 righteous people, then the city would be spared. It wouldn't have to suffer destruction. There's a fantastic tradition about these tzadikim nishtarim, that the world relies upon them, and that in every generation, God ensures that there are at least 36 such tzadikim. They're actually playing from a pasuk that shows up in Yeshayahu, which says, "Blessed are those who will wait for him, lo." And the lamed vav, if you read it separately, right, blessed are those who wait, because tzadikim are understood as having patience. Right? Blessed are those who wait, and those are the lamed vav, right? There are 36 such people who always are waiting on Adonai's redemption. And so it is read by the Talmud as showing us the number of tzaddikim that exist in any generation, right? Not just in a city. It's smaller than you might have thought, right? Again, seemingly implying that just a small number of righteous people can bring about a favorable judgment for all of us. Just as Abraham tries to do, sort of talking God down from his wrath to a place where he thinks, well, the human community must be able to measure up now if they just had a minion of righteous ones. So too these tzaddikim sort of talk God down from his strict and stern judgment to a place of relenting and saying, okay, there is good in that place. I'll give it a favorable judgment. We have many such examples in our tradition of such righteous ones. One of my favorite ones is the Baal Shem Tov. Writing about the Baal Shem Tov, Elie Wiesel, who has one of the more accessible approaches to him in his classic Souls on Fire, Portraits and Legends of Hasidic Masters, he writes that the greatness, that the Baal Shem Tov taught us that the greatness of a person lies in their capacity for humility. The Baal Shem was great not only because of the Torah learning that he had, which was immense, and not only because of the amazing things he could do by the power of God, but because he was incredibly humble. And by humble, we meant he was originally a school teacher. He ran after the kids to keep them safe as they went to Hebrew school. He lived out on the fringes of society in the woods. He wasn't an important person, but he went to great lengths to love and care for each person that he encountered, often lifting them into the presence of God. He would teach, let a person start by submitting to God, and he will grow and he will become free. He taught those around him, the gift of simplicity, and he displayed the gifts of faith, and this was why he was great. Yes, he healed those who were sick, and he blessed those who needed encouragement, and he returned many people back to the path of Hashem, and he paid attention to those who were poor, not just the well-to-do in his society. And he launched a movement that I believe in modernity has saved faith for all of us, Chassidut. I want to tell a personal story about a hidden tzaddik. You may well not know of him, but there was a person who changed the course of my life and who changed the course of Bethany and I's life. There's a humble man. When we met him, this was 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. He was sort of buried in a Beit Midrash in Jerusalem. His name is Rabbi Richie Lewis, or Reb Shmuel Lewis, as we knew him, Reb Shmuel. He was teaching Torah as the Rosh Yeshiva at the conservative yeshiva. He's a small man. I'm taller than he is, right? He's a thin man. He doesn't eat very much. But when you listen to him teach Torah, there's a fire and a wisdom and a complete view and understanding of the world that causes you to trust what he's saying because it's true. And there's a humility that causes him to check any aspects of ego that enabled Bethany and I to say, this is someone who gets it. They understand what faith is about. He understands what a life of Torah can do. He actually sees things, not for how they apparently are, but for how they actually are. He's one of the tzaddikim. And as we've reflected on the course of our life, we could pretty confidently tell you on almost any time we reflect back on this story that coming to trust him opened the door for us becoming Jewish, totally changing our lives and potentially also changing the shape of this congregation as we do our work here as your spiritual leader. Reb Shmuel, one man living a life of Torah, a humble person, a tzaddik nistar, changed my life. When I met him, jury was out, would I be Jewish or not? After I knew him, I thought, yeah, that's a worthwhile way to be in the world. The world stands upon tzaddikim nistarim. We owe them far more than we'll ever know, and perhaps than they will know. These themes that we see in our Parsha of the appearances, of how to learn how something is through investigating in person, and how the world stands upon the tzaddik like Avraham. These themes are something that we need to remember now, and really they apply in our democracy today. Often the only check on the unbridled misuse of power is the little people. The world stands upon these little people, people whose diligence and dedication to completing the work gets the job done and allows each of us to live in freedom. God bless them. Blessed are all those who wait patiently. May you this Shabbat be blessed to understand that appearances are not everything. May you be blessed to investigate before casting judgment. May you be blessed with the righteousness to continue laboring as we all patiently wait for redemption. Shabbat Shalom.